Hi, my name is Rob Dietrich, and I'm a graduate student at George Mason University in their computer game design program. And I'd like to take this moment to show you a bit of what I've been working with as part of my thesis paper/project. And for my thesis project, I've been putting together a little technique I'm referring to as Selective Terrain Expression. And what this is about, it's about being able to take an author-generated mesh. That is something that an author, a game artist, a 3D artist has created. And it's about taking that mesh and marking it up so that certain verts will be able to be affected by a procedurally generated terrain while other verts are not affected by it. And I will apologize a little bit for this stream. 3ds Max is not totally happy with the capture software I'm using, so it's a little bit less performant than I like, but I think I'll still be able to demonstrate the salient points here. So, one of the themes that I encountered while doing my thesis paper, where I've been exploring this idea of artist interaction with procedural content generation. That is, any sort of situation where you'd have a 3D artist perhaps wanting to use procedural content generation in order to, well, generate content, but when artists are often using procedural content generation, there is this sort of intrinsic push and pull between the speed and the convenience of generating content procedurally versus full-on artistic control, full-on artistic granular control. That is, like granular as in like per-vertex control. And this can be a major trade-off. Now, if you're producing procedural content for use in what's often referred to as an online context, that is, at runtime, there's some obvious advantages to using procedural content that you couldn't get otherwise. You know, if you make a game like No Man's Sky or Minecraft, you're able to produce just infinite variations of worlds and whatnot using procedural content generation, and that's an obvious advantage because an artist can't go to each person's house and, create new art for them there. That'd be really cool. If someone figures out how to do that, let me know, but generally that doesn't happen. Now, the less obvious advantages come in when you're using procedural content generation in what's called an offline or authoring context. That is, when you are producing data that at runtime it will look the same as fully hand-authored data, but you've used procedural techniques to put it together. And that's where this trade-off between artist control and sort of the convenience of procedural generation really start to show up. Now, when I looked at this problem, my instincts led me to an answer, which was basically that given this tension between control and convenience, you can encourage greater sort of adoption of procedural techniques if you allow for granular control of the outputs of your procedural content generation to be sort of, you allow for optional and granular control of the outputs. So the way I've kind of approached that is, for the purpose of my paper and kind of as a proof of concept, I've developed this technique, again, which I'm referring to Selective Terrain Expression, and I'll explain why it's named what it is. But this technique that I've put together is a way in which an artist can create a mesh and say, okay, some parts of these verts, I just want them to look like like some sort of terrain. I'm not super picky about what it is, so I'll leave that to the procedural generation. But other verts, like in this example, the verts that make up this scary skull tower, the artist will be very picky about what's happening with particular vertices here. So obviously they want to say, hey, I don't want this tower to be perturbed by the procedural content generation scheme that we're using. So let me introduce you to this demo that I've put together here. Now this is a tower that is existing among some procedurally generated hills, and there's also this little sort of path leading up towards the tower. Now the way I put this together is I started off with, just a simple plane, and then I used some basic editing techniques to bring in this tower that I'd created for as part of another class assignment. I stitch it into the mesh. I do a few more edits to create this sort of road that leads toward it. And then using a custom plugin that I put together, I generate a procedural terrain and I perturb the mesh. However, I've marked up some of these verts so that they will take either complete influence from the procedural terrain, or there'll be verts like on this tower on the road which take no influence from the virtual terrain. And also I have verts that I've marked up to say they will take up some partial amount of influence from the terrain. And the way I did it in this proof of concept is I basically repurposed one of the UV mapping channels. In my case, UV mapping channel 3. Oh, come on, 3ds Max. You can work with me here. Thank you. I've repurposed some of the, I've repurposed the UVs in UV channel 3. Mainly I've repurposed just the U's. And I'm using those to basically mark up the verts that I want to have either complete influence or partial influence. Now this isn't a perfect tool for doing this, and so this is not the prettiest thing to look at. But it should give you some basic idea of what's going on here. So if I go in and I select some of the verts that are living over here, you see these are verts that are mainly related to the tower and the road here, and these verts are not going to be taking any influence from the procedural terrain. Meanwhile, on the other side here, these verts here, which have a U value of 0, and that is sort of the rest of the plane here, these are defined as taking full influence from the procedural terrain. And in the meantime, right in the middle area, say here for example, you have verts, say these kind of boundary vertices, that will take some partial influence from the terrain. So if I can click here and show full results, and I hope 3ds Max and the capture software will cooperate here. Come on. There we go. Now if I go in, I start toying with these verts, you can see that the verts here, the boundary verts that I've been playing with, they change a little bit based on what I'm doing with this setting. And what this setting is doing is when I move more towards the left, towards 0, they take more of the surrounding procedural terrain influence in terms of their Z position. Meanwhile, if I send them over in the other direction, they move back towards that flat position that we had before. And this is a way to help tune those transitions between the procedural terrain and the artist-driven terrain. So what that sort of puts together is what I call the selective part of selective terrain expression. Now, UVs don't have to be the only way you do this. I've talked to some folks, and there have been a lot of alternate suggestions for how to encode this data. Naturally, I could use UVs. I might just use the W coordinate if I didn't want to have an extra UV channel. Vertex colors are often a pretty good way to paint this together. The reason I ended up at UVs was because originally when I was conceiving this, I thought of it as a masking problem. So I thought, okay, well, maybe the artist can define a mask that defines which vertices will be affected. But that just leads to the situation where if you're making, say, a mask texture, you'd be UV mapping that texture in there anyway. And you don't, depending on your texture resolution, you don't have necessarily full granular control on a per-vertex setup, which is what I really wanted. And I thought, well, wait a minute, why am I using the texture? Why don't I just use the UVs directly? And that's how I ended up there. But again, other techniques can be used to, just mark up this extra data per vertex. Vertex colors being a common approach for this sort of thing, because often when you take this mesh and you take a mesh and you put it into a game engine, you might actually not be using the vertex colors in a lot of cases. It kind of depends on your game spec. So again, that was the selective part of terrain expression. Now the other part, so the terrain part of that name. That's obviously because I'm using this technique for the expression of procedurally generated terrain. And what I'm doing here is I am, as part of this terrain merge plugin, I'm generating some procedural terrain. In this case, I'm using just a very basic process. I'm taking a diamond square fractal and I'm just putting it on a height map to create this kind of terrain that I'm using to merge together with my artist mesh. But that's where the terrain part of it comes from. Now, that last word, expression, in selective terrain expression, that's sort of the more important part. So what happens when I take this artist mesh, which looks like this, I'm taking this mesh and I'm generating a terrain to go with it. I'm generating a procedural terrain that I'll be combining with it. And you don't actually see the procedural terrain because it's done in the background here. But I do this procedural terrain, and I have to figure out how I'm going to map verts in this mesh over into the procedural terrain. And the terrain doesn't necessarily have to have the same topology that I'm using here. I'm not requiring that the terrain have exactly this number of vertices available so I can match them one-to-one and push them together. I'm actually using a simple technique where I am mapping the artist mesh onto the procedural terrain, and then I'm mapping them together, on any sort of planar fashion on the x and y plane. I'm just kind of mashing their z coordinates together so they live at the same local transform. And then I am basically going through each vertex in the artist mesh, and I am searching for, within a certain range, for a number of vertices in the procedural terrain that are sort of close enough to that vertex. And then I take all those verts that I find, and based on their range, I determine how much influence they should exert on that vertex in terms of how far they should basically push that vertex up. And what ends up being a sort of a nice sort of corollary of this, or a nice sort of accessory function of this, is that the terrain, as it's presented in the artist mesh, it's actually somewhat blurred. So there is a certain softness to this hills, and that's not actually present in the original terrain. And if I go over here to my parameters and I turn down my search range, that range in which I was looking for candidate verts in the procedural terrain with which to match, if I turn this down, I can set up a situation where I'll generally be matching only one vert in my procedural terrain, and you'll see I'll get a lot more cragginess because the actual procedural terrain that I'm generating, it's not that high resolution. It's I think 32 by 32 tiles, something like that, maybe 33, something of that sort. So it's not very high resolution. But as this sort of corollary of my kind of somewhat indirect non-one-to-one mapping of verts in the authored mesh to the procedural mesh, I'm able to get the kind of, as a bonus ability, this ability to kind of sort of blur the terrain that I'm putting together. And that is kind of why I'm referring to it as selective terrain expression. And that's kind of expression in sort of the expressionist sort of idea of the thing, where I'm not showing the procedurally generated terrain exactly as it is generated. I'm actually taking features of them. I'm kind of taking that sort of, close your eyes to little slits, take a look at the world, that sort of pointillist, expressionist kind of approach to sort of showing a reality without actually literally, mapping that reality out in what I'm producing. So in a way, I am just expressing features of the terrain. So we get a lot of the ideas that were procedurally generated in the terrain, but I'm putting them together and not literally putting them out into the artist mesh. I'm sort of selectively expressing them together. Now, for this process, and now I kind of had to do that, or I decided I had to do that because I wanted to allow the artist to have a lot more freedom in terms of how they can construct their mesh. So if they go in and they produce this tower, for example, that's a lot of extra verts. That's going to be an arbitrary set of verts. If they want to put more stuff in, that's of course going to be all sorts of extra verts all over the place. And I can't really guarantee that there would be a natural one-to-one mapping. So it seemed natural to me to go towards this more sort of selective, this more sort of amorphous, ranged approach to selecting candidate verts. Now, as is natural for having a sort of procedurally generated terrain, if you're generating procedural terrain, you do want to parameterize it and all that. And so in my case, I expose some simple parameters such as terrain height, so you can go and do silly things. No, not so silly things. Depends on your spec, right? You can do things such as change the height of the terrain, make it softer, make it taller, make 3ds Max stop responding. There we go. Bring it back up here, and of course you have a random seed they can use to generate different kinds of terrain. Now, as I've been sort of going through these seeds, you may have noticed it's a fun way to get some variation on possible terrains. So this sort of allows the artist to start off saying like, okay, I'm going to want a tower here in the center of this map, and then I'm going to want some features around it. And they can do that, but you can also end up with situations like this, where you have this tower buried inside of this mountain. Now, depending on what you're doing, like this, I kind of think it's sort of cool. Like there's something, there's a little bit of that sort of Indiana Jones, Last Crusade bit where they find that temple at the end going on here, but that may or may not be matching the artist's intention. And so, as I've been sort of working through this, I think maybe for later variations of this, I'll probably start adding some additional features to allow you to say, like, declare like how much you're going to allow your explicit artist-controlled verts to be sort of moved up or down depending on the height of the underlying procedurally generated topology, things like that. So you could have the option of saying like, okay, I want it to fully take that influence, so I'll push the tower up, or I might say, no, you know what? I do want to bury this tower into this crevice. That would look really cool, and allow the artist to control that. And really, that's been a lot of the theme of my research and the ideas I've been looking at here, where given choices as far as how you're going to be implementing your procedural content generation, if you're working with an artist, your default answer should almost always be, I'm going to give the artist more control. Optionally. I'm going to give the artist the option to have more control, and I'm going to do that control allow for that control at a really granular level, because in a way, in games, the job of the artist is to be really picky, and it's to be really picky about very minute details. They want to control things at the vert level. But for the purpose of, also saving them time, you want them to optionally have the option of not having to control things necessarily if they want to concentrate on the tower but are not as concerned about the terrain. So you want to try to sort of thread that needle and allow that sort of optional control here and there for their purposes. Now, this project that I produced here, this isn't something that I've really produced as sort of something to sell per se. It's not supposed to be an end product. It's more of a proof of concept, but I may try to continue building it out, and I'm going to try to sort of take advantage of this in some of my my other sort of side game projects. But in putting this together, there are a lot of ideas that kind of have sort of occurred to me as I've been working on this in ways I want to extend it. Now, what I think is one of sort of the obvious weaknesses here. There are many, along with the strengths. There are plenty of weaknesses, but one of the ones that really sticks out to me is this need to create this sort of lattice of verts that will be receiving the influence of the procedurally generated terrain. So in a way, this topology that we put here, it doesn't have to map one-to-one to the procedural terrain, but it does have to have enough resolution in order to successfully express the terrain. It has to, have enough verts to modify, to move around. And so there is this dependency. There's a soft dependency between this lattice mesh and the procedural terrain generation you're going to be using. And so I've been thinking about this. I think maybe it's a step that might go forward on this, is that I might go in and create maybe sort of an additional plugin that has sort of similar parameters to the procedural terrain, so you can generate a suitable lattice mesh. And then that lattice mesh is what you would modify, and then you would then produce your procedurally generated terrain. Also kind of related to this lattice mesh, I had to go in and manually stitch this tower into the lattice. And it's not that hard, but if I'm doing a lot of stuff, or worse yet, if I want to move it around, if I want to test things out, that's still a non-trivial amount of work. And it would be nice to automatically stitch that in there. That's another area that I'll probably try to look at. Now, stitching arbitrary geometry together, the general problem there can get really complicated. But I do think there is a little bit of a win that I might be able to get here, in that the lattice meshes that I'd be producing, the geometry that is suitable for expressing procedural terrain, for example, the lattice tends to be very regular geometry. And so that can really simplify that stitching problem quite significantly. So I might be able to work with that and have my sort of auto stitching be correct a lot of the time, maybe not 100%. And because I can't necessarily get 100%, I'd want to parameterize that to allow for, once again, optional, granular artist control of the results. Now, I've been talking about this in terms of terrain a whole bunch, and I went with that because terrain is relatively simple. We're taking this plane, we're pushing it up with a height map. We do want it to be nice, and we want to be sane topology. We don't want holes, all that sort of thing. But it's conceptually relatively simple, and the mapping between the, say, artist mesh and the procedural terrain, it's dead simple. It's this planar XY mapping. I'm basically throwing out the Z coordinate when I determine which verts are close to each other for the purpose of the searching. That's nice and simple. But I would like to explore this kind of process, that sort of expressionistic mapping between the artist mesh and the procedural generated terrain. I'd like to explore that outside of just the mapping of this kind of large flat plane with some stuff on it versus another large flat plane with some stuff on it. It'd be interesting to see how this works with more arbitrary setups, like, say, work it over a sphere or work it over a more human-like shape. I might try and see what options I have for basically trying to merge, I don't know, some sort of terrain with say, the famous teapot or something. That would be a good test of arbitrary geometry to play with. But that's another area worth exploring, I think, for this project. Sort of also connected to this in terms of merging against procedural terrain. Well, actually, no. You know what? I just lost my train of thought on that one, I'm afraid. But yeah, I hope that this technique will be useful, at least for some of my projects, but maybe for others. I will be producing a paper on this for my graduate thesis, and I will that will be publicly posted, and I will let people know once that is there. But you also have this video to look at the data that I've been using for my testing to figure out what is happening there, and that should be hopefully interesting for you in your own explorations into procedural content generation, game dev, and hopefully, maybe I've given you some ideas of stuff you can work with, and hopefully this has been interesting for you. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found the video informative.